What is the gospel according to Thomas? And why wasn't it included in the New Testament? Is there a conspiracy to keep it out? I'm Michael, the Bible rethinker, and it's time to rethink. I remember back when I was in college and I went and saw this horror film called Stigmata. And at the beginning, and I think also at the very end of the film, there was a caption that popped up on the screen. And it said that the Gospel according to Thomas was the most accurate book written about Jesus. So the very next day, I had to go and check this book out. I went to the library and I checked out and I read the Gospel according to Thomas to discover what kind of portrait of Jesus is conveyed in this Gospel. The Gospel, according to Thomas, is a book that was written perhaps very late in the first century or early in the second century. But to gain a perspective of Thomas, we really need to look at the big picture of writing at the time. Really, from the first century on, just like the Greco-Roman world at large, Christians wrote lots and lots and lots of books. Sometimes we just think of the New Testament as being all that was written by Christians, and they didn't write anything else, and nobody wrote anything until modern times. But it wasn't like that at all. People wrote books continually. And the way that people responded to the books is much like we respond to Christian books today. There are books that have come out in the last 30 years, like The Prayer of Jabez, The Purpose-Driven Life. There's the Left Behind series, and we could go on and on. There's The Shack. And these books have had varying amount of influence in the church in the last couple decades. And you've got some pastors who have really promoted some of these books, and you've got other pastors that say, maybe we should shy away from reading those books. And so you've got leadership in the church that would have different views of the different books. So in the first century, there are books that were written, such as the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But you got to remember, in order for those books to reproduce, they had to be copied by hand. So at the end of the first century, a church might have, say, a copy of Matthew. They might have a copy of a couple of the letters that were written by Paul. They might have a book called the Didache. There would be various books they'd have, but none of the churches had all the books. There were lots of different books that were cycling around that had been written by different leaders in the early church. And that continued on through the late first century and into the second. Now, at the same time, Christianity starts as being 100% Jewish. So the very first books written in Christianity were written by Jews and from a thoroughly Jewish worldview, a Jewish perspective. But as Christianity began to spread, a sliver of it at first was Gentile, non-Jewish, but the percentage of Christians who were non-Jews continued to grow and grow and grow and grow until the itty-bitty sliver was Jewish Christians. This is really significant when we study the early days of Christianity, because we have books that are written in the second and third centuries, etc., that really are way more Greek in their worldview and Greek in their style than the earlier Jewish books. So when we read the Gospel according to Thomas, we're confronted with a Jesus who was a sage, a wisdom teacher. In fact, the book consists of nothing but 114 sayings of Jesus. There's no narrative content here. There's no miracles of Jesus. There's nothing about his birth. His crucifixion is completely absent, as is any recollection of a resurrection. In this book, many of the teachings are very similar or even the same as what we read in the canonical Gospels. Let me read a couple examples to you. Saying 26, Jesus said, "You see the mote in your brother's eye, but you do not see the beam in your own eye. When you cast the beam out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to cast the mote from your brother's eye." And also 45, Jesus said, "Grapes are not harvested from thorns, nor are figs gathered from thistles, for they do not produce fruit. A good man brings forth good from his storehouse. An evil man brings forth evil things from his evil storehouse, which is in his heart, and says evil things. For out of the abundance of the heart he brings forth evil things." So, as you can see, some of the content of the Gospel according to Thomas is very similar to that in the canonical Gospels. But there's a fundamental difference between Thomas and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that is that Jesus is presented as a Gnostic teacher. You see, in the ancient Roman Empire, there were all these different secret religions, esoteric religions that had secret teachings that you had to be initiated. You had to be part of the group to hear these teachings. And so naturally what happened is as the gospel was presented in different parts of the Greco-Roman Empire, there would be people who were from these sorts of groups, and they would hear about the teachings of Jesus. But then they would kind of integrate it into their existing worldview, their existing religion. And so the Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus as an esoteric sage, a person who has secret or hidden things to say. In fact, the book is introduced that way. Here's what the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas says. "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, in which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, 'Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death.' Jesus said, 'Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all.'" So the book presents as being written by Thomas the disciple, but the truth is there are no scholars that actually attribute this book to the disciple. And Jesus is presented again as an esoteric sage, somebody who doesn't pronounce things openly, but a person who keeps everything hidden in secret. This is in stark contrast to, say, the Apostle Paul, which purposely got himself arrested and got himself before Caesar because he intended to tell Caesar about Jesus. And you can't get any more public than going before Caesar and telling him about Jesus. In stark contrast, in the Gospel according to Thomas, Jesus is presented as this person who has secret teachings that would circulate, well, secretly. In fact, the meaning of a lot of Thomas is quite unclear to me, and I think unclear to any modern reader, because it would have had a secret interpretation that has been lost. Thomas is what we call a Gnostic gospel. Gnostic or gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. But the idea here is not that Thomas has general knowledge for everybody, but secret knowledge that is only known by a few. This idea is conveyed later on in the Gospel according to Thomas. Saying 13, Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me who I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up." And so Thomas allegedly had secret knowledge, secret truth that he was told directly by Jesus. What were the 3 words? Well, they're never revealed in the gospel, but maybe some of these little churches who followed this line of thinking, this kind of Gnostic Christianity. Maybe they knew what the three words were. But the truth is that from its very beginning, church leaders rejected the gospel according to Thomas. Again, it wasn't that there was a centralized authority dictating which books would be accepted and which would not. And the intention was in this network of churches to preserve what was taught at the very beginning. What are the original teachings of Jesus? What historically happened with Jesus? If Thomas's gospel is accurate and it's all there is about Jesus, it's very difficult to understand why on earth he was crucified in the first place. You don't get crucified for being sort of a Greek philosopher in Judea. And even if he did raise the ire of the Pharisees, which he probably would have, the Sadducees wouldn't have cared, and surely there would have been no interest in Pontius Pilate crucifying Jesus. So if Jesus was just a teacher, it's really difficult to understand why, from the first century, Christians claim that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Where did that idea come from? Well, it's certainly not in Thomas. Thomas doesn't deny it, but it simply doesn't mention it at all. It just has sayings of Jesus. Perhaps the strangest part of Thomas is the very last verse. Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This curious and frankly bizarre statement and attributing it to Jesus has been quite puzzling to scholars. There's various proposals that are suggested, but none of them are very satisfying. And the demeaning way in which women are spoken of here does not seem to reflect Jesus at all, at least according to the canonical Gospels, because there he makes women the very first witnesses of his resurrection. The outlook and attitude toward women is quite different than what we see in early Christianity, where women were given respect and dignity well beyond what they were in Greco-Roman culture at large. So we have writings in the 2nd century and beyond that assert that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the authoritative accounts of what happened with Jesus. Matthew and John were both disciples of Jesus, and so they were able to write from their own perspective. Luke's introduction said that he went and interviewed various eyewitnesses to generate his document. And Mark was closely associated with Peter, which would have had firsthand accounts of what Jesus had done. But beyond that, when we look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are each thoroughly Jewish in flavor. Matthew's Gospel starts, for example, by emphasizing that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham and of David. When Jesus is born, he's very clearly compared to Moses, right? We have Herod that's killing the children in Bethlehem, which reminds us of Pharaoh. When the wise men come to baby Jesus, they remind us of the Queen of Sheba and others that came to pay homage to Solomon in the Old Testament. Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness to be tempted by Satan, which reminds us of the Israelites spending 40 years in the wilderness. My point is that the themes, the way Jesus' life is framed, is thoroughly Jewish, which suggests that those accounts of Jesus are very old. They're older than the account given by Thomas, which is far more Greek. And so by the time the church kind of settled on the books that were canon, the books that would be included in the New Testament, there were books that were a sure thing, that there was no debate over, that there was widespread use of. And that includes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, several letters written by Paul, etc. There were books that were a little more iffy, like 2nd Peter, Jude, Revelation, 2nd and 3rd John. There were also debates on whether 1st Clement, a letter that Clement wrote to the church at Corinth, and whether the Didache in a book called Shepherd of Hermas, and whether or not they should be included in the canon. So there's a little bit of debate about what should be included and what should not. But there was also a list of books that absolutely were completely rejected by the vast majority of Christians from the beginning. And among those was the Gospel according to Thomas, as well as Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, and the list goes on and on. There were lots and lots of books, and several of these did not reflect early Christian teaching at all, and therefore they were excluded. But you're welcome to read them. You can find these books in the collection called the Nag Hammadi Scriptures. They were discovered in 1947, and you can buy a copy of it or you can read them online. They're available for you to peruse yourself and give your own thoughts. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the like and leave comments and questions regarding this video today. And please visit my website at thebiblerethinker.org, where you can support this channel and receive access to exclusive content.